Story 1. The House Where 8 People Never Saw Morning. I was a journalist, 29 years old. I believed that everything has an explanation, every crime has a motive, and every house is just bricks and mortar. But the Villisca house took that belief from me. Not all at once, not with a single event, but with patience, like something that knows it has enough time and no need to rush. The story begins on the morning of June 2nd, 1912. A neighbor noticed that the doors and windows of Josiah Moore's home had been locked since early morning. The cattle hadn't been milked, the chickens hadn't been fed. But the strangest thing was the silence coming from the house. No children's voices, no sounds of dishes, not even the sound of breathing. A silence of a very particular kind that only 2 things can produce. Either the house is empty or everyone inside is dead. It was because of that silence that the neighbor called for help. When they broke the door down, they found something that changed the small town of Villisca forever. Josiah Moore, his wife Sarah, their 4 children, and 2 young girls who were guests, 8 people, had all been murdered in their beds with an axe. Every victim's head had been covered with a sheet. The curtains were drawn. Every mirror in the house had been covered with old clothing. And the killer had gone, as if they had simply dissolved into the air. 100 years later, the magazine I worked for decided to write a special report about this case because it had never been officially solved. And I volunteered. At the time, I thought I would see an old house, take some photographs, and write a good report. But the Villisca house had prepared something else for me, something I never wrote in any official report. Until now. I spent the first night in the sitting room. The same room where Josiah and Sarah Moore had been killed. It was close to 11 when I felt the first thing. Not heard. Felt. A pressure in the air directly above me. But because I was alone and didn't want to prove to myself that I was frightened, I found an explanation and went to sleep. I woke up in the morning and found that the blanket I had placed on the sofa was lying on the floor. I thought I had knocked it off in my sleep. I went upstairs to see the children's rooms. When I entered, there was a strange smell. Not the smell of age, not the smell of dust, the smell of hair that had just been combed. A completely living smell. It was because of that smell that I was truly frightened for the first time. Because the house was a museum and nobody lived in it. I spent the second night in the children's room. I wanted to prove that the first night had been nothing. But the second night was entirely different. It was close to midnight when I heard crying. Not from outside, from inside the wall. A muffled cry like a child trying to hold back the sound. Because the sound was real, not imaginary, not wind. I got up from the bed and pressed my ear against the wall. The sound stopped, but after a few seconds from that same wall, a small hand knocked from inside. Once, hard, and then silence. I ran out of the room and closed the door. I stood in the hallway, breathing hard. But then I saw something that I still see every time I close my eyes. At the end of the hallway, where the darkness was complete, a shape was standing. Small, the size of an 8-year-old child. Its clothing belonged to another time, clothes from the early 20th century. Its face couldn't be seen because the darkness sat precisely on it, but I could feel it looking at me. With every part of my body, I could feel it. That shape stood there for a few seconds, and then it didn't leave. It simply was no longer there. As if a slide had been changed. I shouldn't have stayed the third night. But I stayed because my report was incomplete. Because I couldn't write I saw nothing when I knew that was a lie. It was close to 3 in the morning when I heard footsteps on the stairs. Slow, one by one, like someone with no weight but the stairs creaking under them anyway. I was sitting in the sitting room. I turned on my flashlight and stared at the door. The footsteps reached the hallway, reached the door, stopped at the doorway, and the door opened, but nobody was there. An empty space in the door frame. The air went cold, not gradually, all at once, like a refrigerator door swinging open. And then, in the space between me and that empty doorway, I heard a voice, quiet, exhausted, like a child using its very last strength. It said, "Turn off the light." I did not turn that light off. I ran out of the house and never went back. The report I wrote contained only history and statistics, but this was the reality. This was what happened in that house. The killer of Villisca was never found. The case is still open. The house still stands. Because people still go there and spend the night, reports still come in. Sounds from inside walls, shapes in the darkness, and a child's voice asking you to turn off the light. I still don't know why, but from that night to this day, I have never turned off the light in my bedroom. Story 2. The house that was never finished. I won't write my name. I am an architect, 37 years of experience, but I had never seen a building that seemed to have designed itself until I went to the Winchester house, a house built because of spirits. And when I came back from it, I was no longer certain that spirits don't exist. Sarah Winchester lost her husband in 1881, the son of the founder of the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. She inherited an enormous fortune, but wealth couldn't fill the emptiness left by the daughter who had died years before, and now the husband who was gone. It was because of this brokenness that Sarah sought out a spiritualist. The spiritualist told her that the spirits of those killed by Winchester rifles were following her. Thousands of spirits from the American Civil War, from the Western Territories, from every bullet that had ever left the barrel of a Winchester rifle. She must build a house, he said, but she must never finish it, because if construction stops, death will come knocking. Construction began in 1884, and until the day of Sarah's death in 1922, 38 years, it never stopped. The result was a three-dimensional labyrinth of 160 rooms, staircases that ended at ceilings, doors that opened onto blank walls, windows in the floors, corridors that looped back into themselves. As an architect, I had a special permit. Because of that permit, I could access sections closed to the public. Rooms whose doors were locked from the inside, corridors that didn't appear on official maps. And one thing was clear, this house had been built for concealment. Not for living, for hiding something or someone. I spent the first day trying to draw floor plans, but every time I thought I had found a pattern, something broke it. Because of this confusion, I began to think for the first time that perhaps this house had been designed this way deliberately, not to confuse humans, but to confuse other things, spirits that travel in straight lines, spirits that use short corridors and logical staircases. A house with no straight logical corridor is a trap for spirits. I set this thought aside, but the first night wouldn't let me forget it. On the first night, close to 1 in the morning, I heard footsteps from the upper hallway, soft but continuous. I went upstairs, but the hallway was empty. I came back down. The sounds started again, this time from below, from the basement. I went down. The basement was empty. But because I wanted to be certain, I lifted my flashlight and checked every corner. In the last corner, the northwest corner of the basement, I saw a door I hadn't seen before. A small door, close to the floor, like a coal storage door. It wasn't locked, but when I reached out to open it, something from the other side held it firmly shut. Not a lock, not a jam. Something on the other side was holding it. I let go of that door and went upstairs. Because I am an architect and know that old houses are full of strange things, I tried to find an explanation. Air pressure, humidity, swollen wood. But the second night changed everything. The second night I sat in the blue room, the same room where Sarah claimed to speak with spirits every night. It was close to midnight. The air was heavy. Suddenly a cold came, not from the window, from the middle of the room, from the middle of the air itself. And then I saw that on the chair across from me, an old wooden chair that Sarah used to sit in, something was sitting. Not a complete shape, not a clear apparition. A pressure on the chair, a depression in the old cushion, like the weight of someone seated. But nobody was there. Because I couldn't leave the room, my legs wouldn't move. I mean this literally, as if the floor beneath me had become heavier. I simply sat and watched that depression, and then I heard a voice, not from the wall, not from the ceiling, from exactly that spot. A woman's voice, old, exhausted, that said, "They're still here." 3 words. Then the depression in the cushion was gone. The cold left. The air lightened, and I sat in that chair for 3 full hours without moving, not from fear, but because I didn't know what would happen if I stood up. The third night was my last night in the Winchester house, but I didn't stay until morning because something happened that broke my limit. I was walking through one of the dim corridors on the 2nd floor when I saw that at the end of the hallway there was a window that wasn't on my floor plan. I walked toward it. Through the window, the courtyard was visible, but in the courtyard, in the moonlight, someone was standing. A woman. Long black dress, white hair, looking up at the window, looking at me. I turned on my flashlight and directed the beam toward her. But the light passed through the woman, through her body, and hit the wall behind her. And the woman, without moving, without turning, dissolved. Like smoke in wind. Sarah Winchester died in her sleep in September 1922. It is said that on the very night she died, workers were still hammering. When news of her death arrived, some nails were left half-driven. They are still in the walls today. You can still see them, half-sunk, waiting for a final blow that never came. It is because of this incompleteness that I could never forget that house. Because the Winchester house is like those nails, unfinished, waiting. And what Sarah feared was coming for her. Perhaps it is still there. Perhaps still trapped in those endless corridors, perhaps still searching for a way out, and perhaps this is the most frightening possibility. It cannot find one. Story 3. The House Whose Girl Never Left. My wife and I moved into 508 North 2nd Street in the town of Atchison, Kansas, in January of 1993. An old house, 3 bedrooms, 2 floors. It was cheap, very cheap. But we had just gotten married and didn't ask why it was cheap. Because of that silence, 2 years later, when we found out why, it was already too late. Not to leave, but because we had seen things that could no longer be unseen. The first week was quiet, but from the very beginning there was a feeling I couldn't name. When I entered the upstairs bedroom, the room that was our bedroom, there was a different temperature. Not cold, not warm, just different. Like when you enter a room that someone just left and the air hasn't settled yet. Because I didn't want my wife to worry, I said nothing. This was my first mistake. The first incident happened in late February. My wife was cooking. I was reading in the sitting room. I heard a muffled sound. I ran into the kitchen. My wife was standing by the stove, looking at her wrist. 5 parallel lines on her skin. Lines like the fingers of a small hand. My wife said something had come from behind her and grabbed her wrist, but when she turned, nobody was there. We went to the hospital. The doctor said she had brushed against something. My wife agreed because she didn't want to explain. I said nothing. But on the nights that followed, I heard soft footsteps from upstairs. When I went up, nobody was there. But something was always moved on the floor. An old toy we had brought from our previous house, a shoe, a book, as if someone had been playing with them. Because I wanted to understand what we were dealing with, I spoke with the neighbor across the street, an old man named Edgar. When he heard our address, he went silent for a few seconds, then said, "Sally." I asked who Sally was. He said, "A little girl, late 1800s. She died in that house, appendicitis. But she suffered a lot first, a lot so much that she was afraid of the doctor who came to help her. They said in her final days she scratched at the floor from pain and terror." Then he looked at me and said, "Do you have children?" I said no. He said, "Good," and went back inside his house. After that conversation, I began talking to the house. I know this sounds like madness, but because I had no other option, I would call her name. I would say that we had come, but meant no harm. For a few weeks, the house went quiet. The toys weren't moved. The footsteps stopped. The room temperature normalized. But then, one night while I was at work, my wife called. Her voice was shaking. She said she was in the middle of a game she hadn't started. She said that 5 minutes earlier she had gone into the kitchen, and when she came back she found that on the table beside the sofa, written in dust that had appeared from nowhere, was a name, in a child's handwriting. Sally. I came home. The name was still there. The dust was fresh, not old, not settled, fresh. My wife was sitting in the corner of the sofa, staring at the name. But because I didn't want her to be frightened, I said she had probably written it unconsciously. My wife just looked at me. That look that means, "I know you're lying." That night in our bedroom, close to 3 in the morning, we heard a sound from the corner of the room. A scratching sound, like fingernails on wood, slow, rhythmic. I went to that corner, I turned on the light, I saw that on the wooden floor in that corner there were fresh marks like fingernail scratches, fresh, gleaming, as if drawn just a second before. Because my wife was crying and I didn't know what to say, I sat beside that corner and said quietly, "Sally, we know you're here. We mean no harm." Silence. Then, and I had never told this to anyone, a small hand came out of the empty air and curled its fingers around my thumb. Cold, small, real. 1 second. Just 1 second. Then it was gone. My wife ran out of the room. I stayed sitting there. Not from fear, because that hand had been so sad that I couldn't stand up. So lonely that my heart broke. We left in January 1995, 2 years after we arrived. But leaving didn't finish it, because even now, whenever my wife wants to dust a room, before she starts, she pauses for a moment. She looks, as if waiting for a name to appear in that dust. And I still, in whatever house I am in, when I wake at night and look at the dark corners of the room, I search for a small shape, a child, sitting and watching, who is alone, who doesn't know how to leave. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, I think that small cold hand is still searching for my thumb, in that old house, in that dark corner, still waiting for someone to sit beside her and not say they're leaving,